In this video I will talk about the very simple router table I made in a previous video. Now here we can see the holes and the grooves for the plunged router fence metallic rods. And my first idea was to insert some screws in those holes. And I would screw them against the plywood edge. After that, I would put the screws with the washers to press the router base, but the screws go loose in the rod holes. So when I use the washers to press the router base, they push the router base against the marquetry board, and I can feel that deforms the router tabletop. Some people disassembles the fence rods. And in that case, we wouldn't need neither the screws with the washers nor the screws to attach the base against the plywood edge. I would use a straight router bit to route some grooves. These ones I drew on the plywood. I would put the rods in the holes in the router base. And then I would tighten the knobs. Then I would fit the rods in the grooves to finally hold them with some wooden blocks. But I think it wouldn't be easy to adjust the groove's depth. I think I would make them some deeper, and then I would adjust them with some pieces of paper to level the router. But finally I decided to insert these screws. But I didn't realize the drill chuck was grazing against the router collet. So now the drill chuck is full of scratch. Well, I hope you are more careful with your tools. Now the plastic case in this router is weaker than the case of the router in my other router table. So I decided to put there this piece of plywood. Like this, the car jack will push against the plywood. I think it leaves enough room to ventilate the electric motor. And because this is an old router, I will simply use epoxy to stick this. If someday I need to unscrew the router case, I think it will be easy to remove the plywood. Now I think the board can bow with time, so I will hold the ends with some shelf angle brackets. This edge in this piece of plywood is perfectly straight, and I use it to check if the router tabletop is perfectly flat. If it is not flat, I can wedge it. It is very easy to change the router bit. Now, if I push right on this column, the router moves down quite straight. But if I push right on the other column, we can see there is some play. This happens in all the plunge routers I have, and it also happens in all the plunge routers I could check. But when I use it in the router table, we can see how the router bit wobbles slightly when we lift it. Well, we cannot see it very well in the video. Besides, if we lock the router and we move the car jack down, the router bit moves down slightly. So I must keep the car jack pushing against the router, or I must keep in mind that the router bit will move down slightly. Another thing, if we move down the car jack, we must remember to move it up before we release the router. A good thing in this router table is that I have the same height of cut as the plunge router by itself. Here we can see how the collet almost reaches the top surface. Now imagine we have here a groove in the router tabletop, and I want to use this mortising jig. Well, let's imagine the groove is here. And let's imagine that here the fence is parallel to the groove. I could route like this. But if now I want to route a longer tenon, When I move the fence, now it is not parallel to the groove, so I cannot push the jig, because the fence blocks it. I could move the fence away, but when I reach the router bit, if I don't have the fence, the router bit will push the workpiece like this, and that will ruin the tenon. Maybe I could clamp the workpiece here, but that complicates a task that is very simple if we have an always parallel fence. Now this is my simple router table, and when I route this could happen, because it is lightweight. But because my car jack router lift is on a heavy concrete block, now the router table is more heavy, so it won't move so easily. Anyway, I will put more weight if needed. Wood doesn't slide well on plywood, so I sanded the plywood, I cleaned it, and I apply a primer. And I do the same in the front of the router table fence. When the primer is dry, I sand it with a very fine grit sanding block. I clean it and I paint it black. And I also paint the router table fence. When the paint is dry, I sand them with a very fine grit sanding block. I clean them and I apply a couple of coats of hard transparent varnish. And when the varnish is dry, I sand them with a very fine grit sanding block. So now the workpieces will slide better, not like on a smooth metallic top, but good enough to route more easily. And finally, as you can see, I have a safety switch. I got it from an old woodworking table. I recommend you to always use a safety switch when you make some kind of contraption, mainly if the electric tool trigger is always on. Thanks for watching. If you think this is an interesting video, don't forget to click like and share. And if you like my videos, don't forget to subscribe to my channel.